Hello, everyone. My name is Jacob Fortum. I'm the host of this podcast, Doers Within Emerging Markets. And I just want to share my experience with using Anchor so far. So when the pandemic started, I thought about starting a podcast. And the whole idea was to bring in some really amazing folks that are doing some great work in their respective industries within the emerging markets. And the Anchor platform really helped me get the word out there and also just make it a lot easier for me to invite the guest and just share the amazing experiences they've had and the amazing work they're doing in their respective industries within the emerging markets. So it's pretty fun. You don't even worry about the technical part of making a podcast. You actually just focus more on the content. And Anchor has done it really well for me. So I will highly encourage anybody who is trying to start a podcast to try to use just check out Anchor, and I think you won't regret it. I'm not a technical person, but if you listen to these episodes that I've been publishing so far, it seems like I know the technical part of it, but Anchor helps you take care of the technical part, and you just focus on the content. So feel free to check it out. I highly encourage you. Won't regret it, and it's right there. You don't pay anything, so. In times like this, I think starting a podcast and getting the word out there, irrespective of what you're doing, will be a really great experience. So thank you guys for listening to my episodes. Please check out Anchor and you will have a great time. So cheers, guys, and see you guys next episode. Thanks. So hi everyone. So this is time for emerging markets, doers within emerging markets. I'm here with Jessica Lee, and Jessica Lee has, I think, a CV that most of us crave to have in our 70s or 80s. But she's just a really fascinating individual that I came across, and I think. From her story today and kind of what she has been doing for the past few years will be relevant for a lot of people to learn from her, as well as kind of know what she's doing. Just a brief background about Jessica. I'll let Jessica introduce herself as well. So she graduated from Harvard in 2019, and currently she's now an investor at Soma Capital. I think one thing that's fascinating about Summa Capital is like invested in Flutterwave, and I think it's a very popular African company. It does a lot of stuff in Africa. It's based in California, but it's one of those unicorn companies that most Africans, especially Africans in diaspora, look up to as a benchmark for success in Africa. One other notable thing, and I'll let Jessica kind of take over the conversation, is she worked with Oliver Hart, who was a Nobel Laureate, right?
Yes.
And I just found that pretty cool. But I think most importantly, kind of what she was working with him was game theoretic approaches to analyze multilateral bargaining in China. And we'll probably get into that, but I thought that was really fascinating as well. So, Jessica, I'll give you the floor, please. But by the way, how are you? It's everything.
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. We're stuck in Cambridge. I've been in my room for a really long time, but
yes, it's been, everyone's getting a little stir crazy from the quarantine. Totally feel that.
Yes, but want to make sure you're first of all happy and healthy and safe. So, why are you now?
Definitely. I'm in New Jersey, so I'm actually home with my mom and staying with her and my grandma during this time.
Oh, that's pretty cool. I'm happy to hear your family. So just give us I know, can you just tell us like where you grew up? Just give us like a very good background, like where you grew up and stuff like that. That would be pretty cool to start with.
Yeah, totally. So I was born in the States and in Indiana in particular. My parents were still graduate students at the time, and so they didn't have the resources to raise me. So I was raised by my extended family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, my cousin as well in China, in different parts of China, specifically in Zhejiang as well as Shanghai. And then moved to the US during grade school to New Jersey, which is where my parents found a job eventually. And so I've been in New Jersey for really ever since then, except for college and post-graduation. But yeah, that's kind of where I grew up, and then happy to go into more details on my background since then, but that's a little bit on me. I guess after making it to the States or back to the States, went to high school and middle school here, and was really involved in research, and thought I was going to pursue that kind of in the long term, which I guess as of now hasn't been totally the case, but really enjoyed it and really enjoyed kind of the process of discovering new things and creating new things. And I guess that's kind of the overlap with venture, which is where I work now. Went to Harvard for college, studied applied math that focused on economics and computer science, and during school was pretty involved in investing. So invested on my own really since late middle school, early high school, just for financial security and empowerment and to help my family and my parents. But then did it at a higher level for different funds on campus, as well as through different internship opportunities, and really enjoyed the process of analyzing companies and triangulating between different types of data sources, both qualitative and quantitative, to paint a picture of a company or an industry and its future. But then wanted to get more involved with these companies. Obviously, in the public markets, you can't really get involved in any way as an average Joe in any of the companies you're looking at. But in the private market, specifically in venture, I felt that was really possible. And so I felt like venture was a really great way to combine the intellectual process that I loved about investing with the hands-on approach that I also wanted to take in terms of adding value to these founders in the earliest stages, right from the start, and being really long-term partners, really capital and incentive-aligned partners with these incredible people who are super non-risk averse and really changing the world. And so ended up doing some more venture work during college, and then doing it full-time as well now with Soma Capital.
That's pretty cool. I think just in with the kind of the venture capital experience, and you did a bunch of venture capital related projects. Actual work when you were at Harvard. But just kind of go back into the beginning, like how was it growing up in Indiana versus versus New Jersey? Like what was the
Yeah, so I wasn't in Indiana for very long. I left when I was 7 months old, but I can talk a little bit about growing up in China and so versus New Jersey. And it's definitely, incredibly different for many, many reasons. I think I saw the cultural differences from the start in terms of the different priorities, the different approaches to education. In China, there's a huge emphasis on memorization and regurgitating information and competition, whereas I think in the US, there's much more of a focus on collaboration, really understanding the root of a particular principle or law or whatever it may be in different fields. And so felt that kind of wasn't just in school, but it's also a part of how people interact with each other after school, outside of school, in business, in relationships as well. And felt that it transcended different boundaries within China. And so I think culturally it was quite different and quite an adjustment as well. And I think also in terms of coming to New Jersey in sort of the middle of grade school and not having friends or communities through my parents or through myself, that was a little bit challenging, but I think it was really good lesson of how to build things from the ground up, because I came to the States, obviously had my parents and they've been incredible and a huge positive influence on my life, but I think it was a really good lesson of how to formulate relationships and how to formulate communities and networks from the ground up without kind of having much of a foundation in that space. So really different culturally and also really big adjustment when coming here, but I think kids sort of adapt more quickly than adults, and so I was glad to come earlier than later, and so I felt fortunate about that. And then also was able to kind of have an early lesson in a formative period in my life around, again, building from the ground up.
Exactly. I think I just want to, it was great to get that perspective, because I'm just curious how, navigating, I know there are kind of you might have a lot of kind of personal experiences that help shape how you can navigate different cultures, and just being able to adapt to a new situation, or just even how you think about, or how do you actually approach companies as a VC, right? Like you have this way of looking at how can this be different from the last company I looked at, or something like that, right? I think maybe those formative years shaped. Do you think that has some degree of influence on how you look at your work, in terms of like how you came here and you kind of adapted to different systems, and hopefully relating to entrepreneurs and seeing how to think about your business models or how to solve problems?
Yeah, totally. I think, lots of things you mentioned, and I think fundamentally a lot of it is about understanding and connecting with people. I think if you, grow up and you kind of make friends based on like, who your older brother is friends with or who your parents are friends with, that's really great as well. And you might definitely have lots of genuine connections there. But I think if you come like I did to a new country that's very different in kind of practically every way, and you're forced to create friendships or connections with classmates, with neighbors, with teachers, etc., without kind of having additional support or existing foundations from your family or from your childhood, etc. I think it really forces you to understand people better and understand how you can relate to them. And so I think that was really helpful for me to do really early on, and learn to do really early on as well, so I could continue to develop that skill over time. And I think the other aspect also towards the end of understanding people, I think when you have experienced many different cultures, you tend to be more open-minded. So, ideas that seem crazy, you don't think they're actually that crazy, because I think you've seen so many different things, not, better or worse, or forward or backward, but just different. And I think you're really open to the universe of possibilities when you've just seen more in general. And I think being able to see different cultures, not just through a book or through a video or documentary, but really kind of up close and personal, being fully immersed in that is really great, and broadening your horizons and opening your mind. And so I think that's been helpful for relating to entrepreneurs who are sometimes doing things that are quite out there, but may end up being really incredible and really great, but might seem a little bit out there to the average person at first blush. And so I think that's also helped me to understand people better and be more empathetic and be more open-minded. And so I think that's been really helpful in terms of building relationships with founders, either ones I've invested in or just ones who are doing really interesting things, as well as kind of evaluating more moonshot ideas that are potentially, riskier, but also more transformative if they do work.
So I think that's a really great way to actually see how that kind of applied to your work. I think something that people are curious about, like what do your parents do, and how did that affect kind of how you came about? I'm guessing maybe you had some career switches along the way, but like what are some of the lessons that your parents taught you, or something that you saw from their work that actually kind of shaped your thought process, but just how you actually came about to being now a VC, an investor at Soma Capital, but kind of your career as of now and moving forward?
Yeah, definitely. So I'd say a couple key ways. The first is both my parents are electrical engineers, and they studied that as their PhD in school, and then they ended up working at different companies in the field, kind of bouncing between different companies, but all in the broader sort of systems engineering space, electrical engineering space. And so I think from an early age, I was able to see a lot of the work, maybe not, truly understand it, but at least sort of see them working a lot at the cutting edge. Maybe not so much like the visible cutting edge. They weren't, since they're at the systems layer, it's not, they're making phone chips, to be more specific. So they're not, like creating the next iPhone or something, but they're creating things that are powering the next iPhone or iPhones in general or other, phones and devices that we use all the time around the world. And so I think it was really interesting to kind of see them being so innovative or being innovative along with their company and their teams, of course, but then not kind of having that front row seat and connection to the user. And so I think what I realized was that I wanted to do something that was also innovative, because I liked kind of the idea of creating something from nothing, moving the world forward, coming up with new ideas and novel approaches, whether it was, reinventing a whole category or just improving a process. I felt like both those things moved people, moved companies, moved society forward. But then I also wanted to have a more direct user connection, especially because from an early age, I always wanted to better understand people. And I felt like psychology in many ways was super fascinating to me, and kind of growing up in different areas and making friends in China and then coming here and making friends again, as I mentioned, kind of in the previous question. I really love the process of getting to know people. I think we need perhaps more than my parents did or ended up doing. And so I wanted to incorporate that user connection that they didn't really have in terms of what they were doing. And so I think I wanted to do something similar yet a little bit different. So that's kind of in terms of like their own careers and how that shaped me. But then I think the other aspect too is that my parents, so both of them grew up in super poor families, and then they were really poor. When they came to the United States, they were making around like $80 a month and trying to live off of that, which is why they weren't able to support me. And so seeing them come from quite literally nothing and growing, themselves and our family. I have a younger brother now, and we live, obviously much more comfortably than we did, back when they first came to the States. So seeing them build a life for themselves, both generally as well as more specifically financially, has been super inspiring for me. I think it's been a really shaping influence on my life. And so I think a lot about how do I plan for the future? I guess it's a broader idea of delayed gratification. And I think that's what, I think about a lot in general in terms of like how I live my life and exercise and jobs and things like that. But I think in particular as it relates to finances, obviously, spending what I need to and doing what I need to get by, but really thinking about saving for the future and how I can sort of think about compounding effects over the long term versus, just like trying to spend everything now, and even creative ways around investing and really bringing, financial empowerment into my own hands. So it's not up to my boss or up to, various bosses I may have for the years, or up to the economy. Obviously, all those things will have influence, but really kind of putting myself at the center and not being a victim or being kind of just a part of the story, but really being the main actor or actress, if you will, in my own story of financial empowerment and hopefully success.
That's pretty. I think you're not just. I mean, your parents have to be, I think, very proud of what you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think I also think your story will actually inspire a lot of people to not just on the financial side, but to know there's hope on the other end. If you put your mind to it, if you see challenges, especially immigrants, how you can use that, even though it's something that unfortunately your parents might have gone through, but you just flip that as an advantage, and trying to see good stories within that. That's pretty amazing. I think it's something that a lot of people admire once we share this episode in the podcast. And just so let's just like kind of fast forward to when you got into Harvard. How was it like when you got into Harvard? Were you so excited? Or
so it's really incredible. Yeah, really incredible experience. I think it was especially exciting. I'm the first person in my family to go to school in the States. And also, I guess stereotypically, but perhaps some truth to it, people in China do care a lot about sort of the brand name element of schools, perhaps more than people in other countries or other places. And so I think it was a really proud moment. And I think for a lot of people, getting into college is an individual experience, which is, totally valid. It's their work, their experience, their life. But I think for me, it was very much a family success. And so I think I was really, happy, obviously, for myself, but also even more so for my parents and my aunts and uncles who had raised me, and my grandparents who had raised me as well in China. And I think it was just a really great moment for all of us. And I think it was really incredible too to just see, I'm living with my grandma now, so I think we talk a lot, obviously, and she shares stories about her own life all the time. And so it was really incredible just kind of thinking about, her life and how far our whole family line has sort of come in the matter of a couple generations. And even thinking about, my mom was going to school, my grandma would be sewing a backpack for her overnight, just so that in the morning she could have something to bring with her and her books and, whatever else she had. I'm not even sure if she had books, but whatever things she needed to bring to school, to now where, obviously I don't need to do that and can certainly buy a backpack for myself and more. And so I think it's been really great to kind of see the growth of our family over many generations, but then still kind of maintaining that really strong connection. So we're not, obviously we all have different experiences and we're in different stages of life, but we're still really connected. And I guess especially during this quarantine time, we're all literally at home, still spending a lot of time with each other, eating dinner together and sharing stories and still being able to connect. And so I think it was a really great moment for our family, and knowing that we were so connected, even if we were having these different experiences, and that everybody was really a part of that. And I think that was really special too, because they grew up in China, and so it wasn't just like, a random aunt I had never met but like heard something about, but it's someone who actually played a big role in raising me in some formative years of my life. My parents came in obviously at birth, then a little bit later on after I had moved to the States to rejoin them. And so I think it was a really great success story that tied myself to my parents' nuclear family, and then also to my aunts and uncles and grandparents.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so I think that's pretty cool. Just to get into so why you were at the school, the small school near in Cambridge, as people say. How did you get into VC? I think people are curious about that. I think traditionally people always think about, someone who has worked. I think like a traditional VC person is someone that probably has like 5 years of experience post MBA, has worked for a VC fund, maybe Bain Capital, and then the traditional sense of it, like exactly. how in your undergrad you already part of you got just even getting into that space, and it's a very tiny, it's very selective and male dominated space to some degree. And I think to now, how did you get in there, and how, in fact, what made you get, you have talked about what made you interested in VC, but how did you get started into that?
Yeah, totally. So I'd say kind of my big lucky break, if you will, was working with Rough Draft Ventures, which is General Catalyst Student Founders Fund. And so I think what was really helpful there is that they were specifically recruiting, Rough Draft specifically was recruiting for students at Harvard and other universities in the greater Boston area, so MIT and Northeastern and Brown, et cetera, to be a part of the Rough Draft program for a year or more, depending on when you graduated and whether you wanted to continue. And obviously the focus of the fund as well, not just on the venture side, but in the startups they were investing in, was student focused practically entirely. And so I think that was a really great exposure because it had the legitimacy of General Catalyst, which is obviously a very large, very well-known, very famous fund, and they're really incredible supporters of the fund, and were quite active in terms of giving us advice and giving us even like the space to meet and giving us their brand name and things like that. And so I think that was a really great experience because most funds obviously would much rather hire people with more experience, or at least who have graduated college. And so I think it was really great for me to have the opportunity to be involved in Rough Draft that's very student oriented, entirely student run, student focused, sort of student everything. And so I think that was a great lucky break for me. And part of it was just kind of building these relationships over time. I think venture is a really unique industry because so unlike, very large, tech companies or banks or consulting firms that many people are probably familiar with. Venture capital firms are usually pretty small, so they hire a couple people every year, and some investing teams are just like a handful of people or even less or just slightly more. And so people need to be really, really great friends, almost like family, for lack of a better word. I think it's possible to work in like Facebook without loving every single person at Facebook. In fact, that's probably the most common experience. Would be a bit strange if you didn't know everyone at Facebook. But I think venture is kind of the opposite, where you do have to know everybody because there's only so few people, and you do have to work really well together, but not really well together in the sense that you all have the same skills. You have to be really complementary, so you kind of cover all your bases and think of as much as possible. Obviously it's not possible to cover every single base, otherwise everyone would be making all the right investments, but as much as possible cover all the bases and think about all the different upside and downside and in between scenarios. And I think you really need a diverse base for that. And so people really want to vet you, not just as, an employee, seeing if you're smart in Harvard or not, but really vetting you as a person, as someone I would like to spend, many, many years with. I think that's the other thing as well, is that a lot of companies, tech, finance, consulting, have these sort of 2-year time horizons. And many people do stay, but most people do leave. And so even if, you don't get along with someone so well, you kind of know that either you or they or both of you guys will be gone in 2 years or even less. Whereas I think venture, it's much more of a lifetime business. And so maybe you will leave, maybe you won't, but it's much less likely that you'll leave in just 2 years. You'll probably stay for quite a bit more. And so I think it's really important to take a very network of like cold calling 500 people, but network of, a close-knit, really genuine, really personal network, and really get to know people over time. So not overnight, but really over time. I think other jobs you might be able to cold call your way into overnight, but I think venture is an area where you really need to take the time to get to know people and get to know yourself and see where you fit. And so I think what was helpful was that I kind of started a little bit early in the beginning of college. So I'd say my freshman year, late freshman year, kind of got more plugged into what is VC versus banking versus, all these other fields that people lump together in the broader world of finance or business. And so I think what was really helpful was getting an early start to that, to just learn what even is venture, is it something I want to do? And then once deciding that I did, kind of reaching out to different people like Peter Boyce, who founded Rough Draft, and Natalie Bartlett, who until recently was leading Rough Draft, and getting to know them over time, and also adding value along the way. I think it's not just, let me have coffee with them for 30 minutes and talk about the weather and my life, but really thinking about ways in which I could help them, even if I wasn't at the time or maybe ever going to be a part of their group, but really kind of adding value before asking for anything. I think that's just, a good mentality to have, but I think it's especially important in venture. And I think it's something that, is still definitely part of the job as well. Sometimes we'll meet a founder and maybe their round is super competitive. We don't yet have the opportunity to get an allocation in their round, but then what we will do is prove our value to begin even before we do get allocation, and show them how we can be helpful with introductions to potential hires or potential customers or board members, people like that. And then down the line they'll remember, oh, Jessica or Soma Capital or Rough Draft or whoever it might have been was actually super helpful even before we gave them anything. And then they'll have a fond memory of us and really know that we showed and not just told our value add, and they'll probably think of us much more favorably for allocation. I think that's broadly true of venture, whether it's getting allocation in a deal or getting a role at a venture fund. And so I think I took that mentality from a really early age in the start of college, after figuring things out quickly for myself, and then kind of had this long-term approach and value add mentality to building networks, and had a lucky break with the student founder specific fund. So I would recommend kind of A, having that mentality, and then B, kind of if you're a student looking for funds that specifically look at students and would need students, like Rough Draft or Dorman Fund or Contrary Capital, or if you're a new grad, maybe funds like Insight Venture Partners or Bessemer that hire a lot of new grads and have kind of a culture and a program specifically for new grads, at least in part of the business. And so I think kind of looking to see where you would fit, or even if, you're a couple of years out of your career, maybe you haven't had the opportunity to do much in investing, but your experience is in deep tech. Maybe you did aerospace engineering for a while, which is seemingly very different from venture, but actually you could look at funds like Lux Capital that do lots of deep tech investments, and they might actually need your deep tech aerospace engineering expertise more than a traditional venture background. So I think it's really about finding the fit, and overall the industry is hard to break into, but I think if you find the right entry point that is a good fit for who you uniquely are as a person, it is a really great start.
I think it's pretty key, because I think one is just like, first of all, your mindset should not be just trying to take advantage of basically what you're saying is that you have to go with the mindset to help, and yes, to actually, I think first, personal connection is key. I think the second thing is more about providing value add rather than getting value from them.
Yeah.
And I think third is starting where you can start, right? Not trying to aim too high, which is good to aim high, but just what is close to you is something that's more feasible, and with time you can actually you build on that, right?
Yeah, so, exactly.
I think that's great. That's a great advice. I think most people want to get in, they want to do it they just want to get there, but there's a process to it. So that's great. That's really great. Beyond Rough Draft Ventures. So Rough Draft Ventures was started by Peter Boyles. He's
exactly.
I just kind of saw he also worked at the Alumni Ventures Group, and you were also at TechStars. I think this was it still at the same time you're working at Rough Draft Ventures, or these were other experiences you had? I just want to know a little bit about how these other experiences help you get to Soma Capital. Then we'll get into Soma Capital after that.
Yeah, totally. So I think the way in which I thought about it was I wanted to have be able to have different experiences. So if Rough Draft, that was something I was doing. If another fund would offer me a very similar experience, even if they were great fund and great people, I probably wouldn't take on that role. And so I always looked for ways in which to learn something new, but then also be able to get sort of complementary skills, so that it wasn't, super disjointed and then I was just doing, 10 very different things, but having enough overlap so that I would be able to have transferable skills, but then not enough overlap that I would be doing, repeat work or just not learning. And so I think the way in which I thought about different funds that I worked at over time, so I can talk a little bit more into the specifics, but Rough Draft had the student founders focus, and I think also had this unique aspect of putting students, venture partners like myself, into the decision-making roles. I think typically, obviously people my age and students for sure, junior people new to the field, usually have input into decisions, but aren't the people actually deciding. But I think what's really great about Rough Draft is that it was all student run. And so you were able to kind of be a partner in some way for a year or however long you stayed with Rough Draft. And so I thought that was really unique. And so that was my first role and something that I really loved. And then I guess in terms of other funds that I worked at. So for example, Global Founders Capital they're technically sector agnostic, but at the time I joined them, they were looking more into consumer investments. And so I wanted to kind of get into the mindset of how would you evaluate consumer-oriented deals, since it's obviously very different from enterprise deals, and there's more variability and unpredictability, and different just whole evaluation process. And so was able to learn a lot from that. And then Romulus Capital, where I also worked, is a little bit later stage. So Global Founders Capital is very seed stage. Rough Draft is like pre-seed and seed. And then Romulus Capital looks more at the Series A, and they write larger checks as a result, since they tend to like to lead rounds and also the stages later. And they also only look at B2B, business to business, so more enterprise, kind of the other side of things relative to consumer. And they're also very research driven in terms of the types of innovation they invest in. And so I wanted to learn more about that very different angle of investing and later stage. And then lastly, had also worked around the same time at Female Founders Fund, but that interestingly wasn't an investing role. It was do work to support the portfolio, which is obviously another crucial part of venture that I wasn't previously involved, because previously I was just looking at the life cycle beyond that of actually supporting these companies. But I think the Female Founders Fund, I was able to see more of that as well. Then as over time, aside from Soma, as my kind of in a casual capacity, of being a slave factor or anybody in the ecosystem as needed. And then TechStars was not a non-investing role. So what I do there is more on the content side of curating the startup digest. So making people aware of different venture, tech, or founder-oriented events for them in the greater Boston community, which is the geography that I focus on, relevant and in line with my interest and my skills, but then still being able to add different value to each and have, not a conflict of interest, and then also be able to learn as I go in each role and be able to grow from each opportunity as well.
Yeah, that's I think the fact that you went out there to learn different skills in order to kind of be well-rounded, I think that made you stand out, I think, right? Kind of give you that upper edge. That's pretty well. So let's get into Soma Capital. I think that is it's a very interesting. I think it was. Can you tell us about Soma Capital and like how is it working there, and kind of your experience and what you guys are investing in?
Yeah. Totally. So a little bit more on Soma. We're a seed stage fund, and we're sector agnostic and we're geography agnostic. So as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, we're investors in Flutterwave, which is building the Stripe for Africa. They processed, this was, when we last spoke with them a little while ago, but they had already by then processed over $3 billion in payments, which is really incredible. They recently raised their Series B, and I'm sure, by now they've processed much more payments as well, and seen lots of growth geographically, payments-wise, integrations, customers, etc. So in general, we're just super founder and team oriented in our evaluation. We know that in the early stage, in the seed stage, the product and subsequently the market will likely change over time, and so we want to really focus on what won't change for the most part, which is the founders and the team, and making sure that this is an incredible team, and even if what they're building will change down the line, as it frequently does or frequently should, we're backing kind of the right people that we love working with, and they'll enjoy working with us as well, and so that's kind of how we think about things, and that's why we're so diverse in terms of what we focus on. We feel like talent is really universal. Opportunity might not be, but talent is really universal, and so I think that's why we are really other geography. We're only focused on this particular sector. Great businesses can come out of really anywhere, even places that people might have not paid a lot of attention to, and so in that regard, we're really all-encompassing and just really focused on understanding and getting to know the founders. And I think that's what's been really interesting about the work there as well, is that it's not so much, is this number 60 or is it 62? That's obviously important, and we try to know, about the metrics and the market and things like that before we go into a meeting and as the broader context. But I think so much of it is about getting to know the founder as a person. Is this someone who's really process-oriented and not outcome-oriented? Is this someone who's willing to do something ridiculously difficult just for fun because they love it? Is this someone who's super selfless and able to put the company before themselves? Sometimes, as the company grows or as it changes, maybe they're no longer the best CEO for the business, and it's time to give more responsibility to their co-founder or to an early team member or to an outside CEO. Are they willing to put the company before themselves if there is ever a conflict there? Is this someone who's able to be a contrarian thinker and see where others have missed opportunities or just haven't seen it all? But then are they still, rooted in evidence, and are they still grounded and data driven? And so I think much more of our questions and diligence process is around, understanding how the founder solves problems, how they see the world, how they think through situations, how they are as a person, then, grilling them on particular metrics or statistics or things like that. And so I really enjoyed that. And I guess a final word about my role there. So I'm actually the first full-time hire with the team. So we're kind of a startup in ourselves in some ways as well. because we have been around for a while and we have lots of interesting resources. My boss, for example, owns the Sacramento Kings NBA team, and then his father had founded TIBCO Software that had a multi-billion-dollar exit to Vista, the private equity fund, a few years back. And so we have lots of really interesting consumer resources on the NBA team side and enterprise resources on the TIBCO side. And we have a lot of really interesting portfolio companies like Flutterwave that you mentioned, Ironclad, Cruise, which sold to GM for $1 billion, Astronis, and Lambda School, across all kinds of sectors and geographies. We're also investors in Rappi, but then the team is still really small and we still have a long ways to go in terms of establishing ourselves in the long run. And so I felt like it was a really interesting opportunity to be able to work with these incredible resources and incredible companies and incredible track record, but then still, be able to contribute in a tangible and a palpable way to the future of the fund and by extension the portfolio companies. And so my role involves a bit or a lot of everything, kind of looking at newer seed stage deal flow, helping to fundraise so that we have the capital as well to be able to deploy to companies now and in the future, looking at follow-on opportunities in our current portfolio. So after we do the seed stage, companies in our portfolio might look to raise a Series A, B, etc. So evaluating companies over time, even after the initial check, and then also supporting companies and connecting them with each other, hosting events. In the fall, we brought the NBA to India for the first time ever. And so part of that was hosting different events to bring greater visibility and connectivity to our very large India-based portfolio of founders there. And so that was really exciting and really different. And so there's different kind of interesting things to do like that along the way to kind of just connect more people in the ecosystem so that they can help each other and we can further help them.
That's pretty cool. Just do you have to be an NBA Sacramento's fan to join this venture?
You could be any fan, and we have it's super funny because sometimes we'll bring our portfolio companies to games and then they'll be from like the other team or not literally obviously, but they'll be from their hometown, and so we'll be kind of rooting for different teams, but it's quite fun. It's quite fun.
That's pretty cool. And I like that. So one of the things that I think you kind of mentioned, I think I briefly looked at Soma Capital on the website and stuff. And I think what is pretty incredible is like you guys look at founders first before you kind of look at the numbers. And I think for most emerging markets, I mean, this podcast is about emerging markets. Most emerging markets, we don't have data to back up some of our ideas. I mean, the data is very limited, and you might definitely know this more than I. But there's a lot of you can't do a lot of research in terms of like, is this something that's feasible or not? Because there's just a lot of ambiguity, right, and a lot of instability. So I think kind of that the kind of the model you guys use to kind of figure out what to invest in, especially for emerging markets, specifically Africa, is a very I think that's the most practical and feasible way that you can actually get the right entrepreneurs. And I think case in point, the Flutterwave that you guys invested is by itself, and I know that many other companies that you guys have invested is kind of a good example that what you guys are doing is right. That's pretty cool. And I know I kind of looked into you do write for this company called Alpha.
Yes. Alpha, yes.
Yeah, can you share a little bit more about it? I think I've read some of your articles, and they're just pretty amazing. How has that experience been like, and how did you get involved in Alpha to begin with?
Yeah, totally. So a little bit more on Alpha. Alpha actually started off as an internal community in Y-Combinator, both for their full-time team and different startups who've been through the accelerator over the past few years. But then they actually spun out of Y-Combinator. They were initially called Leap when they were part of YC, and then they spun out of Y-Combinator in early 2019 or late 2018, and then rebranded entirely as Alpha. And so I joined just as a member initially in the early days, I think around January of 2019, after hearing about it, and then just like, for no particular reason, invited tons of my friends who were all kind of broadly in the venture startups tech space, and they all ended up joining, or many of them did at least. And then so the Elpha founders actually took notice, and they were like, "You've actually invited more people to the platform than anybody else. Like, that's really amazing." And so I was stunned as well, but excited about it, of course. And then they asked if I wanted to come on as an ambassador to bring on more members and just spread the word about Elpha in general. And so I was happy to do that. And that was kind of the first way in which I got involved. And I guess just a little bit more context on Elpha. So we're essentially a platform for women in tech venture and startups all around the world to be able to connect with each other virtually and speak with each other candidly online. So it's a bit similar to Reddit in terms of having that forum structure where people, members of the platform, can ask questions, can post thoughts, share stories, share articles, whatever it might be, in a very spontaneous, very organic, very conversational manner. And then other members will see that and then respond with their advice, their thoughts, experiences, etc., and really have a conversation in a forum thread on the platform. And so I think what's different about Elpha relative to Reddit is that Reddit, it can be quite helpful, but then there also is, some amount of questionable content there because anybody can post anything. And I think that is sort of the downside of anonymity. But I think what's really great about Elpha is that it's a closed community, not in the sense of being exclusive, but just making sure that every single person on the platform is truly a woman in tech venture startups. There's no bots or people with bad intentions. Then once you are logged into the platform, you can certainly post anonymously, especially because a lot of the topics can be more sensitive or more taboo topics where you don't want your identity associated for understandable reasons. And so people will post about, more mainstream stuff like job searching or, fun stuff, as well as kind of more serious topics around sexual harassment or pay inequality, things like that. And so it's a really great way for women to be super open and honest and supportive of each other. So it has, all the benefits of Reddit, of, being super helpful and crowdsourcing kind of ideas sort of on demand, but then also has, the positive aspects of being a really strong, really positive community. And then over time, so kind of back to my involvement with Elpha. So after being an ambassador, I was obviously in touch and working closely with the founders and the rest of the early team. And they had seen that I had been at the time running sort of my own column on seed and Series A founders. And they really liked that I was writing and I guess my style of writing as well. And so they asked if I wanted to just come on as sort of a blogger, running my own column on Elpha, bi-weekly, featuring, instead of founders, which is what I was doing before, but focusing on female operators at larger tech companies. And that was really interesting, kind of something I hadn't explored before. I guess the broader idea that I mentioned with venture funds of wanting to do something similar, so that I had the skills, had the experience, and was able to, have transferable skills, but then still doing something different to be able to learn and branch out. And so that was kind of a good example of that as well. And then in the summer of 2019, in August, they went through the Y-Combinator batch, the summer batch, and so they had their demo day along with all the other companies that went through YC, and they raised their seed round, and so they were able to pay people and bring on more people on a contract or part-time basis, and so they brought me on around that time in early fall of 2019 as the head of content. And so now I'm plugged into, so as mentioned, most of the platform is this sort of organic forum style content, but then where I'm plugged in is the long form content, so getting members on the platform to write more intentional, more deliberate content in the form of like an article, even sharing their experiences, their advice, and their actionable insights as well, and then doing some interviews myself of people on the platform and just really interesting women who are pioneers in their respective fields as well.
And that is, I'm just as guess when you're talking about it, one of the things that came to my mind was, first of all, this is an incredible platform. I think a lot of young women and have to hopefully learn about it, and also like read a lot about the article. I think it's gonna be a very, I think the future of entrepreneurship and VC has to be more women and minorities. And I think based on historical evidence, that has historically not been the case. And I think having such having this kind of platform and having you write about success stories of some of these women in tech can add so much value.
Thank you.
Kind of show. So it'd be definitely great if this can be shared with a lot of more people. I think I'll actually include it at the end with the link to give you the articles that can be sent out. I think it's pretty formidable. And just a side, just a little bit about Alpha. Are there certain common challenges that you see when you interview these women, and kind of I know we have, so like one thing that I saw, like Sherry Sandberg wrote the book Lean In. That was like a kind of really, really interesting book, and I had to read it just to understand some of the societal limitations that has been created, but how to overcome this challenge as a woman. And definitely I'm not a woman, but there are certainly certain societal limitations that even if you're a successful woman, you still face some biases, if I can say that, right? So is there any common theme that you see when you interview these women, despite their success stories? You realize that there's so much work that we still need to do, or there's this element of bias that we still need to overcome?
Yeah, totally. I interview a lot of female founders for the platform, since a lot of the people on the platform are female founders as well, or aspiring to be. And so I think one really interesting challenge, I guess, kind of connecting my role with Alpha and the VC world as well, is that a lot of times women are creating businesses for women, or largely for women, which is obviously half of the demographic of the world, and maybe actually a little bit more than half based on like current statistics. So a large population, a large market, and just as large as the male population. But I think when they're pitching to investors are largely men, especially at the partner level. Largely, I think it was like 96% or some crazy statistic like that, not even 51 or 52. And so investors frequently, especially in the early stage when there isn't much data to go on, they kind of rely on their own experiences, or the experiences of their wives or their daughters or their mothers, which are obviously women as well, but these are not necessarily representative women of the broader population of women, just because they might be of a different socioeconomic class by definition, I guess, since it's an investor's wife. And so I think a lot of times women who are pitching to male investors have a lot of difficulty kind of getting empathy and getting understanding at the very important product level or need level that they need. And I think a lot of times investors, I don't think it's intentional, but they can end up kind of missing out on opportunities just because it wasn't something that was really relevant to their own experience. And I'd say actually the other thing too is that from the founder perspective, there's a saying I've heard, I don't know who said it, but men pitch unicorns and women pitch businesses. I think men in general, not, obviously everyone, but in general have perhaps more confidence, and part of that's cultural, maybe part of it is biological as well, but just per confluence of factors end up having more confidence at the aggregate level. And so they end up going into these investor meetings and just saying, I don't know what's going to happen like this year or next year, but in 10, 15 years, we're going to build a big unicorn. We're going to change, all of fintech or whatever field it might be. And then in the early stage, investors love, big ideas and visions and, all the things you see on Silicon Valley, like the HBO TV show or things like that, and TechCrunch Disrupt and all of that. And so I think that ends up winning over a lot of investors. And then women who are generally, kind of on the flip side, a bit less confident than men, they want to focus on the details of like, this is how I'm going to get the warehousing relationship, and this is how I'm going to hire my team members, and this is the timeline, the roadmap for the actual product, and we're going to add this feature tomorrow, and then this the next week, and then we're going to do beta launch and alpha beta. And so all these things are really important, and if you were just evaluating the practicality of the idea, you do need the plan, of course, to execute. But then women, I think, get so caught up on that they don't end up talking as much relative to men, or relative to a particular standard, about the big idea, which is what investors perhaps ultimately want to hear and what gets them excited, because nobody gets terribly excited about warehousing relationships, even if they are super important, but they do get excited about transforming the whole logistics space or something like that. And so I think That's kind of a natural disadvantage in terms of how women pitch as well. So I think a first step to all of this is just being really mindful, because I don't think anybody is malicious or bad in terms of perpetuating this. It's all I'd like to hope at least it's all very subconscious. But I think one good step is for the investors to realize, the male investors in particular, like, yes, I might not be a woman obviously, and I might not have wives or children who are representative of the average woman in America, and obviously I'm not going to go and change that, but I should be aware of that and bias that comes with that, and being more intentional about seeking to maybe talk to more people or look at data instead of relying on just asking their wife if a product is interesting to them and making a decision based on that. And then similarly on the founder side, it'd be helpful for women to say, yes, I do focus a lot on the business, I'm not going to stop focusing on that, but maybe in the pitch I'll incorporate more of the long-term vision. And so I think that's kind of helpful as well.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I mean, interesting enough. So I started, I came across this, I think, by the way, I think this can be a whole different conversation. It can be a whole episode, because I think there's so much to unpack. And I think, with whatever is going on right now with this pandemic and stuff, but I think one other thing that we have to start paying attention is how to include all these populations that have been underserved and underutilized, and especially in the VC world, there's a misallocation of capital, and that kind of have spiraled down into how companies, who are the people that benefit, how wealth creation is developed within minorities as well as women, right? So there's a whole conversation about that, and I think that's, if something has to be changed. And there's this interesting study from a professor at Harvard Business School, her name is Laura Huang, and she does research studies on biases in VC and angel investment, and she wrote a book called Edge. I think it's called Edge, and so fascinating. Maybe you've come across some of our work, but just pretty cool. And I think this has to be intentional. I think where you are and what you have done so far, it's a great example of how we need people like you in the space, but also it's a great, definitely, I think you deserve everything you're doing right now and where you are. And examples like this have to be promoted and shared, and I think we have to be conscious about it, both men and women, into it. But I think this is a great. I really want this to get ahead. Like, people should really be aware of it and think about it intentionally. But just to continue with the emerging markets, because I think that's a great conversation, and I think it's still valuable. And just making sure, kind of round this up. So I think one thing that kind of intrigued me, and I think it relates to emerging markets, is when you were working with Oliver Hart, and just a brief experience working with him, and just kind of what you did and how that maybe helped you in the VC world.
Yeah, totally. So working with him was really incredible. I think it was just so inspiring. Obviously, he won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2016. So you'd think that, somebody like him would already feel, on top of the world and things like that. And he has every right to be, but he was so humble. I'll actually just talk about one specific example. So one of his students, so he's quite, he's been in the field for quite some time. And so his students are now adults and professors themselves. And so one of his students from, I guess, a while ago is actually the dean of the business school at Tsinghua University, which is the pretty much, broadly agreed #1 university in China, and has written actually this really influential book that I had read that was related to my research. And I had told Oliver Hart that I had read this book and just, how much I liked it and how formative it was. And Professor Hart actually said, oh, well, actually the author himself will be in town in Cambridge, next week or whatever it ended up being, I can introduce you. And so he put us in touch, and I was like, great, where should I meet him? I was thinking at the library or a coffee shop or something like that. And he was like, well, actually you can meet in my office. And so I thought he just was maybe out of town that day, or just away the whole day or something, and his office was just open. And so we went and met there, and we ended up having a really great conversation and speaking for a really long time, me and his student who wrote this book. And then when we left, I guess around an hour later, Professor Hart was literally sitting on the bench outside of his office and like eating like his lunch just like on this bench, even though, you know, obviously like his office is very nice and has a bunch of tables, and he could have just come in and even like sat with us or just like told us to like find another spot or, you know, something like that. But he or he could have knocked or, you know, tried to make some passive aggressive noise outside so that we knew he was there and would leave. But he, you know, was just so you know, patient and waited outside, and he has just like no ego in the world and is just the most humble person ever. And, you know, you'd imagine somebody like him would receive lots of emails, and I'm sure he does, but he always responded to every single one of my emails like within a day. And he made his own like vacation responders when he was traveling, and he was traveling a bunch, and he has an assistant like all professors do, but I never, you know, communicated with her. He scheduled all of his own meetings, and he read through my thesis like 10 times over, even though he had his own, you know, everything to deal with. And I invited him to faculty student lunch, and he came and was just super down to earth and was like trying to meet with like all the, you know, cooks in the dining hall, and just like every employee there, and just like trying to say hello and thank them for a really great evening. And so it was just incredible, like, you know, how humble he was, and he was trying to, so obviously blockchain is a relatively new field, not related to my thesis, but a relatively new field. And so he was just trying to learn everything that he could about blockchain. And I had done some, not, you know, actually done work, but had seen some interesting companies in the space through my unique vantage point in venture. And so was able to, you know, chat with him a bit about that. And he never just felt like he knew, you know, the answers or anything like that, and was just always open to having this like open mindset around discovery. And so that was just really incredible of, you know, how he was as a person. And I think just kind of tying it to venture as well, I think just, you know, beyond the research that I did, I think part of it was, you know, understanding how to think rigorously, and he was a big part of that. Then also just kind of keeping this open mindset that he, you know, that I hopefully had before, but that he really, you know, showed at this new level. I think that was really helpful as well, kind of moving into my role in venture.
That is really amazing. I mean, it's pretty humbling, right? Kind of have to achieve that at that level, and giving you that critical thinking that probably helped move across. I mean, I've not met someone who worked for a Nobel Laureate. I think you're the first.
Thank you.
So it's a good experience for me as well. I can brag to my mom, hopefully. So just looking at so I mean, based on that, I mean, just going back to the future of emerging markets, what do you think, based on your tons of VC experience, or maybe your research that you're doing now, maybe doing deal sourcing or due diligence with companies, and some that you've already worked with at Soma Capital, what do you think is the future of emerging markets from your perspective, having done some of the investments that you've done?
Yeah, totally. I can also tie it to my research on China and as well, and also experiences in the country. And so I'd say a few things. So I think firstly, what's really interesting about the China story is that the narrative in the West, in the US and you know, perhaps Europe as well, is that China has been able to see this tremendous growth in the past you know, few years or many years because they've copied you know, technologies in the US, and they've copied technologies in the West more broadly, and part of it was, you know, perhaps you know, IP theft or other questionable behavior, and all of it is just playing catch up and you know, copycat behavior, and none of it's true innovation. I think that's a lot of the narrative in the West, and obviously there is truth to that. Like, of course, China had a longer ways to go than the US, and so naturally they were able to see you know, greater growth rate than the US, and also, of course, you know, IP theft was certainly involved in part of it, but I think it's much less of a black and white story. It's much more of a gray area, and I think people in general have trouble grappling with gray areas just by human nature. But I think what's actually happening in China, you know, obviously, let's say textiles, for example, like textiles, you know, perhaps the factories weren't as developed, you know, 20 years ago as they are now. Sure, that is a, you know, catch-up type of innovation. But then you think about companies like Didi, and you're like, oh, well, that's totally just a copycat of Uber. But actually, Didi has been able to integrate along the supply chain much more than Uber has. You know, Uber has Uber Eats, but it's very much just transportation than Uber Eats, whereas Didi has been able to integrate, well, A, work really collaboratively with taxi drivers, and then B, also integrate into insurance products and into gasoline and things like that. So they've been able to take this approach that's much more integrated than Uber, Lyft, or other companies in the West has. And so that is actually a true innovation that nobody else, or at least the companies, the giants in the West, haven't been able to achieve. And then I guess similarly, you think about delivery. That's obviously something that's on all of our minds now as we're trying to get supplies delivered to us, both for fun as well as for need during this crisis. And you think about FedEx here in the States, which is obviously functioning great company that has innovation, of course. But then you think about all the different kind of e-commerce delivery companies in China, like Meituan, for example, and they have last mile logistics and last mile delivery and intraday delivery just really nailed down, even relative to FedEx, even relative to Amazon or Walmart or Whole Foods, just part of Amazon, and so that's another kind of area of true innovation. And so I think it's very much not black and white. Yes, there is copycat, yes, there is IP theft, but then there is also true innovation. It's a mix of both. And so I think a lot of the stories of emerging markets, not just China, but every other country in the emerging markets now and in the future, is going to be a transition period. You're not going to just be copycat one day and then innovating totally on your own and pioneering everything the next day. It's very much a transition period, and it involves some of the IP theft perhaps or copycat behavior, because you need to start somewhere. But then, afterwards, it is much more about making that transition and making, true innovation, maybe marginally or kind of in small but still really meaningful ways. And so I think a lot of times those stories of true innovation are missed in emerging markets, but I think it's really important to think of it more as a gradual process of changing, from point A to point B, and in between you have A and A star and A slash or whatever, versus just, an overnight transition. And a lot of time is spent in that gray area. The second thing I'd say is that, this whole IP theft conversation, obviously, the US and trade wars that I guess were kind of top of mind before this pandemic happened. But I think that there is a big narrative around China being really anti-business friendly because they don't protect IP as much as the US does, and that has an element of flip side of that. Like, yes, businesses have a harder time in China because they can just steal each other's IP and the government isn't going to do much about it, or governing bodies aren't going to intervene in the same way they would in the US. But actually, if you think about it more in the long term, more at the grassroots level, actually stronger businesses can be created from this, because an IP is sort of a government granted monopoly, which has its benefits, and I'm totally pro patents and everything like that, and see the merit of it. But I think there is still the downside of anything. There's trade-offs with everything, including patents. And with patents, you have a monopoly, and monopoly by definition is the best thing in the world. And so I think in China, what you see is that there's companies like the Meituan founder, for example. He had built like 3 startups or something that all kind of failed, maybe had their moment in the sun, but all kind of failed ultimately before building Meituan. And I think you have that really persistent founder culture. It's not just someone who invented something cool and patented it and then was just kind of riding along this natural monopoly that the government had sort of implicitly carved out for him or her. But I think with China, you see companies that have a harder time kind of getting from 0 to 1, but then once they are at 1, they are so much stronger than perhaps companies in the US, et cetera. And I think that's really interesting as well. And then I think the third thing too is just, with the US, for example, we all have laptops. I'm talking to you on a laptop right now, and it's very common in our work structure. But then I think what's interesting about China is that they skipped the whole laptop era and they moved right to mobile. And so I think in many ways, mobile is the future for the world. But I think the US is almost lagging. I mean, you think about payments, we still have a credit card that's, a little bit of a nuisance to carry, and there's different issues around that. But China just nobody really even has a credit card. It's just your phone. And so the user experiences in China in tech are almost more advanced than the US or than the West. And I think you'll see that a lot in emerging markets as well. You think it's a handicap they didn't have the laptop phase, which in many ways it is. But I think you can also see the benefits of kind of skipping the laptop phase. And there's many, analogy, not just the laptop mobile thing, although that is very big, but there are many kind of similarities along that line. as well. And then I'd say something else too on the venture side. So what's really interesting is that a lot of times, kind of going back to the copycat model, so Soma Capital actually really likes to invest in, the Stripe for Africa or the Stripe for India Razor Pay, which is, I think they most recently raised at $500 million valuation. And so they're very much one of our emerging winners as well. They're in India. And so I think what's really interesting is that there's this sort of negative connotation around copycat models. People are like, why would I invest in Flutterwave? Stripe will just move into Africa and do the same thing. But what's really interesting is that, yes, Stripe is a great company. It's a great American success story, and the founders, I'm sure, are wonderful and they have big ambitions. But Africa is a very different market from the US. And in order to, there's this whole narrative in Silicon Valley around move fast and break things that, everyone's probably heard of. And, there is merit to moving fast and growing quickly and all of that. But I think a lot of times in emerging markets in particular, it's a very delicate situation, and you can't really just go in there and break things, especially as someone who's not from the area, without connections, without relationships, without empathy, without community in that local region. And I think in order to be able to build something from the ground up that's going to be really sustainable and work really collaboratively along the full value chain with potential employees, with potential partners, with potential customers, with local investors, local regulatory bodies, things like that, you really need someone who is from the area, grew up in the area, their family, has been there for generations, and has, connections and has the ability to speak the local language and understand, consumer behavior, not just from reading some kind of CB Insights report, but really understanding it from having been immersed in that area for many years, for their whole life. And so I think, again, yes, Stripe is wonderful, but I don't really think that Stripe, as it is now, would be able to easily expand into Africa, even without Flutterwave. And you really needed these founders who had spent time in Africa and had, I think, maybe grown up in Africa and had family there and just knew the market super, super well. And you really need that founder market fit. You can't just look at founder and market separately, like, oh, Africa's a growing market. John and Patrick, founders of Stripe, are, really smart. Let's just put them together. You need to find that alignment as well. Like, yes, John and Patrick are wonderful, but they're from Ireland and they've spent most of the time in the US. And then Africa, yes, it's growing, but it's not, maybe the exact opportunity for them to capture. And so I think, kind of finding that founder market that is really essential. And that's what we look for. And that's why we are actually quite big on copycat models, I guess, the negative connotation, but we think it's a really positive connotation because it's looking at a proven business model. You've almost de-risked it in many ways, since we've shown that it works in the US and it works with businesses, and at the core, businesses are very similar across geographies. But then what you need is someone who has that understanding of the local market and has that connection and natural empathy, and is able to kind of take this, what is already a successful or potentially successful model, to this growing market. And so I think that's kind of very interesting in the venture world.
That's very excellent. I think all what you listed is pretty, I think that adds the reason why I think you're a successful investor, because you kind of explained everything in details of why. It's a very contrarian approach that copycats at the right investment opportunities, but localizing it, like finding people, as you said, who have grown up there and stuff like that, and that actually be an opportunity to create value, but also create something that's very successful. And sometimes it's counterintuitive for a lot of people. But man, your 4 points were really great. I think this last piece of for this episode is really, really critical, because I think you really listed out what's really important for emerging markets and actually understanding how investment works and kind of some of the preconceived ideas or ideologies that people have about. China is a very, very big market, and there's a lot going on in China and how it interacts with the Western world. And with Africa, I think China and Africa has a very long-term relationship, like almost 30 years. And I think in the future, those China and the African continent will have a lot in terms of partnership moving forward. So that's very interesting space. Thanks for sharing those. I think it's very important for that. And just kind of to wrap it up. So do you have any advice I know you kind of listed some of those key points, but any advice for entrepreneurs and investors, especially people who are starting their businesses in Africa or in China or maybe in Latin America, any advice that you have for people to start to do, like even just like due diligence for themselves, the teammates, the team members or the co-founders, or finding the right investors, like maybe Soma Capital, what should they be thinking about before going into those markets? I know you kind of listed out that you can't just go in there, especially in in West Africa. But what do you think should be the preparation to start off a business, or if you have started a business that has a certain amount of revenue that you want to find a VC to invest in you? What should be the kind of the pre-preparation steps? And can you just talk about it from the entrepreneur side as well as from the VC side? Totally. I think that'll be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll start from the founder side. So I think what's really interesting is that so many times I think people are really used to like, oh, if I have a question or I don't know how to do something, or something I'm just like not too sure about, I'll just look it up on Google. And obviously, Google's a great resource, but I think when building a business, they're really, you can read a bunch of books and people will claim to know the answers in their books or their web pages. But I think when you're building a business, you're really creating something that hasn't been created before, even if it is similar or something, but it is kind of this uncharted territory. And I think especially uncharted in emerging markets where maybe there's not as much infrastructure, and you are really creating a new category. You're creating the first Stripe in this geography to a lot of people who don't yet know what Stripe really is. And so I think what's really important there is to focus even on firstly educating your customer. And I think in the US or the developed world more broadly, there's less of a need for that. People, businesses, as we're accustomed to, like, know that they need Stripe. Maybe there's a debate around whether they want to pay for Stripe or another service, or whether they want this plan or that plan with Stripe, or if they want to renew it. But they do understand fundamentally that they need Stripe. That's kind of a given and an assumption. But I think what's interesting in emerging markets is that a lot of times, in the example, I guess I'll continue with the Stripe example, but a lot of times businesses are currently using cash, for example, and that's what they've always been used to. They're not anti-technology, but they do have concerns, perhaps more than the average, U.S. person or U.S. business owner around technology, and they're more kind of skeptical about it. And so I think a lot of it is really kind of easing into that business relationship and not going in with your product pitch, because you can't assume that the business or the customer, whoever you're selling into, has kind of the same assumptions that you have, or the same assumptions that the developed world has. Maybe you've spent time in the developed world or something like that, so you might have these kind of are taking developed world notions into the emerging markets, but you need to sort of start from the ground up and start in building a genuine sort of value add relationship to your customer, maybe even kind of giving them advice and educating them on what's going on around the world, or what's worked, or what might be challenges with their current approach, not in a kind of like condescending way, but in a really a way of equals, which is, I want to help you, I love this country, or I love this market, or I love this business line, and I just want to help you. And so I think kind of going in with that genuine intention, that helpful value add intention, without any sort of need for an immediate payoff or a short-term payoff, and knowing that you do need to kind of build those relationships and be really education oriented, so that you can tell your customer about the market. And so I think that's really important and really different in emerging markets relative to the developed world. And I think the other part of that too is you yourself as the founder are also learning. So kind of going back to the Google aspect, you're creating a new category, so yes, you have to educate your consumer, but you also have to learn yourself. And I think yes, Google might have some of the answers, but I think what's even helpful is to connect with other people who are maybe one step ahead of you. Maybe they are in, maybe not your exact competitor, but somebody in adjacent space, who maybe, if you're building some kind of business in Latin America, for example, you could reach out to the founders of Rappi, who of course are maybe multiple steps ahead of you, but they have been there before in some way. And so I think kind of reaching out to people and really leveraging your community. I think startup communities in emerging markets tend to be closer. Like, I've spoken to lots of founders in Brazil, and they just like end up knowing each other, even if they're in different sectors, and they're like, oh yeah, I was just like talking to this person like the other day, and that's just really incredible how close knit they are. I don't see that as much in SF when there's like 500 bajillion businesses, so obviously it's understandable why you wouldn't be catching up with all of them. But I think in emerging markets, the founders tend to be much more close knit, so definitely plug yourself into that network, learn from other people in that space, and I guess kind of tying it into investors as well. So look for investors who invested in that space. So in India, for example, Razorpay is kind of our lead investment in India, the biggest company that we've invested in India. Obviously, we invested in them in the seed stage, and they've just grown since then. But companies who are building for India or out of India, when they're looking into us and seeing if we would be a good partner for them, they'll see that we have this really expansive India portfolio, and then they will see value add, not just in terms of that we're likely to invest in them because we've invested in India, but also that once we do invest in them, hopefully we can also connect them with Razorpay, with City Furnish, with these other really interesting, really fast growing companies in India, and kind of help them to bridge that gap and get them further plugged into their own ecosystem, which is really helpful for many reasons, for partnerships, just sharing learnings, things like that. And so I think looking for investors who've invested in that space is really interesting. And then maybe sometimes investors haven't yet made investments in that space because it's kind of a cold start problem. If if they never invested in India, but they want to, and then nobody will take their money in India because they haven't invested in India, it's kind of this whole chicken and the egg problem. But I think definitely do give investors a chance, even if they haven't yet invested in the space, but ask them kind of critical questions around, what do you find most exciting? Let's say, India, I guess I'm on that trend for the example, but, what do you find most interesting in India? What has been your understanding of the opportunities in India? And if they just say something generic, like, oh, I think India is growing or something, it's clear they haven't done their research on that market. But if they give a much more nuanced, answer and really show thoughtfulness and show that they even know some stats around, the Indian market, or, subtleties around different cities or different sectors, things like that, it shows they have been looking into the space. And you can't, really expect them to be the ultimate experts, since everybody's kind of a work in progress. But I think intention is really important. And if they show that they have this intention and have demonstrated and taken steps to really get to know the Indian market, for example, then that's really powerful in terms of, being a really good partner for you. And so I think that's really critical as well. And then I think even a step further, maybe not a mandatory condition, but I think it's always helpful to ask them what kinds of connections they may be able to offer you in the space. Maybe not themselves, but I think what's interesting too is that a lot of funds, even if they're in the US, they have LPs, limited partners, so people who invest in that venture fund who are, people in other countries, especially because a lot of times investors, either wealthy individuals or funds in other countries, will want some kind of global exposure as well. And so it's not just US LPs investing in US funds, but it's Turkish LPs investing in US funds and LATAM LPs investing in US funds. And so even if, the investor, him or herself, isn't able to, help in their immediate network, their LPs obviously want you to succeed as well, since they want their investment to do well. And so you as the founder. And so they're also able to leverage their very diverse and very expansive and very aligned LP base to help you. And so asking about those resources, because sometimes they obviously won't advertise every single LP on their website, but I think, you can definitely ask them in a pitch meeting and see kind of how creatively and how unique and how differentiated they are in terms of the types of network-based resources or just other resources they're able to bring and offer you to help you grow and expand in your particular geography.
That's quite resourceful, and I think you have actually provided a very good sense of just perspective on how to approach it, and it's very practical, it's very applicable, and I feel like there's so much that we can unpack, but just because of timing and making sure that we can be able to provide the right amount of information per episode. I wish we could do this to another 2.5 hours, but I think this is really great. I think what you shared from your life story to how you got inspired by your family, and you kind of saw that as an advantage to actually think differently and get involved in VC and think of finance. And now you're not just working for building companies, but actually transforming lives on a very micro level, right? Doing investing in these companies that affect businesses in India and Africa. I think in the long term, the number of people that you have touched, you probably touch will be very extensive, and you probably change economies as well. I'm pretty excited at how your future will be like. I think maybe just a few years from now, it'll probably be a lot that you have probably, in a few months, in a year or two, you have done a lot more that will be a great example for others to follow. And not forgetting Alpha, the work you do there, I think that's something that's very incredible. And all I can say, just keep doing your stuff. It sounds everything.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it sounds pretty cool.
I loved your questions. It was really great to speak with you, and hopefully this is helpful, and happy to connect with anyone who listens and has questions. I can send you over my email just so you have, or you obviously have that as well, but feel free to include it. People can reach out to me whenever they're like. I'm not super active on Twitter, but I'm super active on LinkedIn, so people can feel free to message me there as well. And yeah, thank you so much for the platform and the opportunity and the really great questions, and love diving into, you know, all these different but really important areas with you all, and hope to be able to do this again.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Of course. Yes. Stay safe and healthy, and looking forward to this. And thank you again for the opportunity. Really loved the full experience, and how wonderful you were also as a host, and just being so responsive throughout it all. So thank you so much again.
Thank you so much. And that's it for our episode today. And Jessica Lee is formidable, just an amazing person, and I hope you guys will enjoy this episode. So thank you guys. Thank you so much,
Have
Jessica.
A great weekend.
You
Take care.
too. Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.